Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me outside? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, can you hear me upstairs? Yeah, okay, I'll pretend I heard people people cry better than that than stamping their feet in a 17th century building. First of all, but just before we kick off, if it might get a little bit hot in here, a little bit stuffy, we're going to do our best to keep everything cool. So I'm sorry about the noise from the fans, from the aircon. There is the fountain outside does have drinking water. So if any of you do come over a little faint, nobody will be offended if you did have to stand up and head outside to freshen up a little. We just don't want any of you collapsing on our hands. Okay, let's kick off. In this time of extraordinary political uncertainty, the temptation might be to retreat into ideas we know, into systems in which we feel comfortable, to work harder, to tighten borders, and certainly not to try any radical reordering of our political and economic landscape. But what if it was these ideas, these systems, these old ways of doing things that caused the uncertainty in the first place? And what if, after all, these new ideas, when looked at with a clear head, are not quite as wild as they might at first appear? Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists and How We Can Get There is a shot across the bows for anyone who has declared that history is over, that neoliberalism has won, that the poor are poor owing to a fault of their character. In short, to anyone who shouts down the idea that we can and should work for a better world. Rutger Bregman is one of Europe's most prominent young thinkers and has published 4 books on history, philosophy and economics. His History of Progress was awarded the Belgian Liberales Prize for Best Non-Fiction Book of 2013, and he has twice been nominated for the prestigious European Press Prize of the Correspondent. The Dutch edition of Utopia for Realists has become a national bestseller and sparked a basic income movement that soon made international headlines. He has contributed to The Washington Post, The Guardian and the BBC. In 2017, he gave a TED Talk with the title, "Poverty isn't a lack of character, it's a lack of cash." Please join me in welcoming Rutger Bregman to Shakespeare and Company. So let's begin, I guess, with the concept of utopia. Mm-hmm. And I guess in a way your title it's quite a provocative one, because normally the idea of utopia doesn't necessarily suggest realism. Mm-hmm. So could you first begin by sort of introducing what the idea of utopia means to you, and
Sure.
why you're trying to bring it back into contemporary political discourse?
Well, if we look at the history of the concept, it goes all the way back to Thomas More, who wrote the book on Utopia, with the title Utopia, and also coined the term. And it was actually sort of a joke. It means both. It means two things, actually. It means good place and nowhere. Mm-hmm. So Utopia is a place that we're always striving for. We always want to go there. But every time we arrive in Utopia, as Oscar Wilde once said, we have to set sails once again and think about the next Utopia that we want to go. So that's what Utopia is for me. It's always a place in the distance, mm-hmm. where we want to go. I mean, the central idea of the book is that every milestone of civilization, the end of slavery, democracy, equal rights for men and women, the rise of the welfare state, these were all utopian fantasies once. Mm-hmm. They were all dismissed as crazy, ludicrous once. Mm-hmm. So in history, time and time again, utopia has become real. The problem nowadays is that we have no utopian visions anymore.
And that's something which I guess, in a way, people might be surprised at when they first open the book, is that you don't begin by necessarily painting a pessimistic view of where we have arrived at in civilization. I mean, in fact, at several instances you say, for most of human history, we have been, if I remember, ugly, poor, sick, we died young.
Yeah.
So in fact, the condition we find ourselves in, let's say physically, sort of with the amount of wealth that we have, is far more advanced than we've ever been.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. You know, that's the first page. For about 99% of human history, about 99% of humanity was sick, poor, hungry, stupid, dirty, afraid, and ugly. You know, that's the natural state of humanity, and it started to change only a very short while ago, about 200 years ago, with the Industrial Revolution. Things first got worse. In England, for example, in cities like Manchester, they're terrible places to live back then. But then after 1850, progress really took off. And probably a lot of you, well, let me ask the question. Who follows the news? Okay, so who feels completely brainwashed? Yeah, so at least you know it. That's great. I mean, if you watch the news a lot, then you hear all the time about things that go wrong. Corruption, crises, terrorism, violence, etc. So if you watch or read a lot of the news, then at the end of the day, you have a completely misguided view of humanity, of human nature, of the state we're in. Because you've only been hearing about all those exceptions. You know exactly how the world doesn't work. So what I always recommend is throw your television out of the window, lose that newspaper and read books. It's a much better way to inform yourself.
And definitely not something we'll argue with at Shakespeare and Company. And yet, so to play devil's advocate for a moment then, throughout human history, you said, we've had these utopian dreams, the end of slavery, the emancipation of women, etc., and we've achieved them. And then you say, now, what we're lacking is a political vision. Is it possible then that we're lacking that political vision because we've arrived? Because, as I think Fukuyama said, it's the end of history. Why? If we needed a utopian philosophy, we would have one.
Well, this is what they taught my generation. So I was born in 1988, a year before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Don't mean to imply any causality, but my generation was told that we had arrived at the end of history, that this was it. But then came 2008, the financial crash, and suddenly the whole story we have been telling ourselves about financial markets that were supposedly, working really well, came crumbling down. And then we had 2016 and the rise of Donald Trump and Brexit. All these things which were completely unimaginable just a few years ago are now happening before our eyes. So I think that nowadays, for many people, especially for young people, it's abundantly clear that we cannot stick to the status quo. That actually the most crazy, ludicrous thing is that we can keep going on like this. That is maybe really utopian. Probably what also went wrong in I believe in 2008 especially, is that crises are great opportunities for change. Those are the moments that new ideas can gain currency. But the problem is that in 2008 we didn't have an alternative. The homework had not been done, the groundwork had not been done. And I'm hopeful that now intellectuals and writers and journalists and also just a lot of regular people coming together have been doing that work, and that now we have at least the beginning of an alternative.
One thing you also mentioned in the introduction is that often utopias, when people think about utopias, they often think of something that very quickly becomes a dystopia. Because when an ideology is perhaps too rigid, it can have certain effects, certain destructive effects on the societies that it's trying to order. Do you think, therefore, after, for example, the fall of the Berlin Wall, do you think people are suspicious of the idea of utopia? And maybe one of the reasons that capitalism and neoliberalism have done so well is that it's quite a slippery kind of adaptive ideology.
That's definitely true. Although I would say that capitalism or neoliberalism in its current form is also a utopian project. It just doesn't see itself that way. Many of these politicians or economists, they say that they're just neutral, that they're pragmatic, but often there are a lot of values or assumptions behind their ideas. In the book, I make a distinction between two forms of utopian thinking. So the first one is the one we're all familiar with, and that is the big utopian blueprints of the fascists and the communists with the 5-year plans, and we have to get there, and if you don't agree, well, then you're in trouble. That is the one we're most familiar with. But I believe there is another form of utopian thinking, which is much more, how do you say that? Modest. It's radical in its vision, but it also knows that the road to utopia is, well, there are many roads to utopias, and you just have to start tomorrow with a small experiment. So, for example, I've been completely fascinated by the rise of the idea of universal basic income in the past 5 years. When I started writing about it in 2013, it was a completely forgotten idea on the fringe of the debate. I was talking in, well, not places like this. I was talking like for, I don't know, 15, 20 anarchists maybe who smelled really badly. That was the kind of audience I had back then. And that's where change starts. You know, real change starts with the crazy ones who are dismissed as ludicrous and who are on the fringes of the debate. But then more and more people started getting interested in it. And now Finland started an experiment. Canada has just announced a big experiment. A lot of people in Silicon Valley are interested. It's really an idea that's sort of conquering the globe, you could say. And I think that's a great example of how utopian thinking can also work. It starts with a crazy vision, but then, it also starts with small steps towards that vision.
And there's a moment when you reference the famous Victor Hugo line of there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come.
Exactly.
And you said about the universal basic income that it is a forgotten idea. And in fact, it's the case with a lot of the propositions in the book, a lot of the ideas that you discuss, that these are not necessarily radically new ideas, but they're ideas which have been proposed at different instances in history. And for whatever reason, and we'll talk about some of the reasons in a moment about why they didn't take root, they've been rejected. But do you? So, for example, on the subject of universal basic income, you have a sense that this is something which is gaining political momentum.
Exactly. I think that. Well, let me first say, not many people know that at the end of the 60s, almost everyone believed that some form of basic income was going to be implemented in the US. And Richard Nixon, of all people, almost did it. I've got a full chapter in the book about that. It's a completely bizarre history. It almost happened, but there were, two big reasons why it didn't happen in the end. First reason is that the Democrats wanted a higher basic income, so they voted against this proposal. And the second reason was that in 1978 there were new results that came in from an experiment in Seattle, a basic income experiment, where they found out that the divorce rate had gone up by 50%. So at that point, all the conservatives said in the US, we can't have basic income because that will make women much too independent. It was only 10 years later that they found out that a statistical mistake had been made. So in reality, the divorce rate did not go up. It's a pretty bizarre history, full of coincidences. There's no big ideological reason or big historical reason why it didn't happen.
It's funny, the fact that the Democrats voted against it, it really does underline how certain people seem to be that it was.
They were absolutely certain. Milton Friedman was in favor of it, the great neoliberal economist, but John Kenneth Galbraith as well. So it was, people thought it was just a matter of time, that this was the future. But it missed its opportunity. And then came Reagan, then came Thatcher, and then history changed course. And
also I think this underlines the fact that, and it's the same with a lot of the ideas that we discussed in the book, is that the old left-right distinction doesn't necessarily apply. I mean, there are certain ideas which might be considered more leftist, or certain might be more liberal, but is that something which you think has become almost moribund now, that distinction between left and right?
Well, it all depends on definitions. So, I mean, you could see the basic income as a leftist idea. It's about the eradication of poverty. It's about giving everyone the means to decide for themselves what to do with their lives. You could see that as a leftist radical idea. But if you think like that individual responsibility or individual freedom is very important, well, that's what basic income is as well. So you could see it as a right-wing idea as well. And I believe that just many people are quite fed up with the all boring political debate between the left and the right. What we have nowadays is the worst of the left and the right combined. So the left doesn't trust people to make their own choices, and the right thinks that people are too lazy and have to be forced into work. Well, what I try to do in the book is to say, well, what if we bring the best of the left and the right together? What if we give the left the eradication of poverty, and what if we give right a very small government in terms of paternalism? Well, that might be interesting, and that's what basic income basically is.
Let's just talk a little bit more about basic income and the sort of the practicalities, because I'm sure, particularly when people first hear of the idea, and I know this was my reaction, which is it's a wonderful idea, but A, is it workable, and B, it's just going to be far too expensive. And yet, in the chapter you have on that, it seems that these are kind of quite irrational, quite counterintuitive responses to the way humans behave.
I think it's far too expensive not to introduce basic income. poverty is really expensive. You know, there's, for example, a recent study in the US that found that the cost of just child poverty are estimated at $500 billion each year. So that's 4% of GDP. It's a quarter of or it's, if you want to eradicate poverty, that's actually a lot cheaper. About 1% of GDP, a quarter of the military budget. Well, it differs from country to country, but I've looked at the numbers in Holland, in the UK, in the US, and everywhere child poverty is more expensive than completely eradicating poverty. So I actually see this as an investment that, especially in the long run, pays for itself. We know from a lot of the scientific evidence, the experiments that I talk about in the book, is that if you eradicate poverty, healthcare costs go down, crime goes down, kids perform much better in school, there are less mental health complaints, and most importantly, no, people don't work any less. Often they work more, or they quit the so-called bullshit jobs and do something that's actually useful. So in many ways, the right-wing arguments that we need more work and we need these value creators, exactly, that's why we need basic income, is because nowadays we're wasting so much of our energy and talent with people living in poverty or people being stuck in completely meaningless jobs. So I often try to turn the argument around. We can't afford to stick to the current system.
And so you cite quite a few studies, some of them quite extensive. The one I think in Canada specifically, there was one. And we like to sort of labour under the belief that our governments read studies and pay attention to results and implement things which are going to be beneficial for populations and maybe going to save money. Why do you think, with this evidence building up, there is such political resistance to this idea?
Well, I'm not really interested in politicians, to be honest. I think that change doesn't start there. It ends there. So if everyone in a country like France or Holland, where I'm from, if everyone thinks basic income is a really good idea, only then they will start taking notice. So, as I said, real change starts on the fringes of society. It starts with the crazy ones, and then it moves towards, I don't know, the regular citizens, the entrepreneurs, the writers, people like you all coming together, hearing about these new ideas. That's where it starts. We are the real politicians, you know. We are the real ones who are able to change the zeitgeist. So, for example, people ask me, "Oh, are you worried about the referendum in Switzerland, where 25% voted in favor of basic income and 75% voted against it?" Well, I'm not worried about it at all. I was incredibly enthusiastic. I mean, just 4 or 5 years ago, about 100 people in the whole of Switzerland even knew what basic income was. And suddenly hundreds of thousands of people are voting in favor of such a crazy idea. I mean, that's quite an accomplishment. In the 1950s, the Swiss voted against another completely crazy, ludicrous idea. A very dangerous idea, which was to give women the right to vote. They voted against it. And then 20 years later, they voted in favor of it. So if history is any guide, in 20 years, they'll have basic income in Switzerland. I think that you really have to remember that if you want to look for change, don't look to, I don't know, the political centers of the world, to Washington or London or Paris or whatever. You got to look somewhere else.
And now to play devil's advocate again, and before we talk about some of the other ideas beyond basic income, and I'm going to stress the fact that I'm playing devil's advocate because, I mean, you get to go home after this. I have to see some of these people once or twice a week. But let's say poor people, you know, if you give them money, they are lazy. They're just going to spend it on booze and cigarettes. They're going to spend their whole days in front of their TV. They're not going to look after themselves well. It's just going to be essentially throwing money down the drain.
Well, that's not a very radical idea, actually. I believe that actually most people think that way, even on the left. I mean, Margaret Thatcher once said that poverty is a personality defect. That's a literal quote from her. That sounds quite harsh, but actually a lot of people on the left assume the same thing when they say, oh, we need to help those poor people. We need to give them courses in financial literacy. You know, we need to help them to make better choices in their lives. The assumption is always the same, that somehow there's something wrong with the poor, that they're somehow a little bit less intelligent than all smart people in bookshops are. Well, actually, again, we've got a lot of new scientific evidence from psychology, for example, and behavioral economics that shows that poverty is all about the context. It's psychologists call it the psychology of scarcity. And there's one very interesting experiment that they did in India that shows how this works. So what they did is, this was an experiment with sugarcane farmers that receive about 60% of their annual income all at once, right after the harvest. Now, this means they are relatively poor one part of the year and rich the rest of the year. Now, they did an IQ test before and after the harvest, and the difference was 14 IQ points. So just living in poverty makes you less smart. It's not that you are by nature more stupid or anything. It's just the context. All of us would make worse decisions, especially for the long term, if we would live in poverty. Now, what that would mean is that if we eradicate poverty, we'll get an explosion of ambition and energy, and suddenly people are able to plan for the long term again. This is what the research shows us time and time again. And that's why the title of my TED Talk was "Poverty is not a lack of character. It's just a lack of cash." And it's very easy to cure a lack of cash. I mean, with cash, obviously.
Like that experiment with the 13 homeless people in the city, I think it was, in London.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just give us a quick rundown of that, because I thought that was fascinating.
Well, this was in 2009 in the city, the financial district of London. And there were about 13 homeless men who had been living on the streets for, well, some of them for more than 40 years. They were really regarded as, well, quite hopeless cases. You know, everything had been tried at that point, and it was time for something new. And then a charity organization said, you know what, we're going to do something really crazy. Let's just give them money. And each of the men received £3,000. And they were completely free to decide for themselves what to do with it. The only question they had to answer for themselves is, you know, what do I want to make of my life? And even at that organization, most of the social workers were quite skeptical. They were like, this is probably not a very good idea. Anyway, let's see what happens. A year after the experiment, 7 out of 13 of the men had a roof above their head. 2 more had applied for housing. And they had been really frugal with the money. One of them had spent it on a dictionary, another on a hearing aid. One of them took gardening classes. And even more interesting is that this experiment cost about £50,000. They had saved money by a factor of about 7, because it's much more expensive to let homeless people live on the streets. You know, again, healthcare costs, policing costs, judicial costs. So even The Economist, you know, not a very revolutionary magazine, I think we can agree on that. Even The Economist wrote at that point, the best way to spend money on the homeless is probably just to give it to them. Now, if it's true for the homeless, then why isn't it true for all the poor? Well, the thing is, it is true for all the poor. That's what other experiments show.
And doesn't this just underline then that ultimately the reason a lot of this stuff isn't put in place, or hasn't yet been put in place, is because we're stuck with this idea of somehow we deserve the money perhaps we're born with, we deserve the whatever the level of our salary is, like in some way, and if you have less than me, you in some way deserve it. Like that's a sort of very sort of moral element in our culture, connected to poverty.
Well, there are a lot of historians who believe that history is basically ruled by money and power. You know, especially the Marxists believe that. I'm a different kind of historian. I believe that ideas in the end matter most. Ideas in the end can and do change the world. So the major obstacle towards implementing something like a basic income is not technical, it's not economical or anything like that. It's ideological. It's just that we're working with a completely outdated definition of what work is, what wealth is, what progress is, what growth is. You know, when politicians nowadays say we need more growth, we need more jobs, they basically say we need more meaningless jobs where people sit in offices all day and send emails to people they don't care about, buy more crap they don't care about, impress people they don't like. That's basically what we mean by growth nowadays. Well, maybe we need a different kind of growth. Maybe we need a different kind of progress.
The difficulty being that we measure, as you talk about in the book, we measure growth via GDP, which is quite unsuited to...
That's the understatement of the... It's a completely ridiculous way to measure progress. Actually, it's interesting. Not many people know this. Simon Kuznets, a Russian-American economist, he invented the whole concept of GDP in the 1930s. Before that, we had no idea how the economy was doing. Actually, the whole idea of the economy didn't even exist yet. There was not a real concept like that. Journalists and scientists just talked about society. The economy had to be invented, and that happened in the 1930s after the Great Depression. And when Simon Kuznets came up with this concept of GDP, which is basically the sum of all the services and products that we sell to each other in a certain year, he said, all right, you can use this, but don't ever use it as a measure of progress. And if you do, then at least abstract all military spending, subtract all military spending, all spending on the financial sector, and all spending on advertising, because that's all completely worthless. Well, look where all the growth has been in the past 20, 30 years.
Which also brings us on to the sort of another one of the major ideas, which is that we should work less.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's funny because if you read any sort of political theory from let's say there's sort of early 20th century and before, there always seemed to be this ambition that sort of with human progress, humans would be working less, or perhaps ultimately not at all. Certainly on the so-called the bullshit jobs, whatever they were at the time. And yet this is something which has not only not come to pass, but people seem to be working more than ever before. Why?
It's one of the big questions, actually. I begin that chapter with an essay that John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, wrote in 1930. It's called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in that essay, he makes two predictions. The first one is, we're going to get a lot richer. If we don't make big mistakes like world wars and, austerity during depressions, well, we all made those mistakes. But anyway, we'll be a lot richer, about 4 to 8 times as rich as we are now in 2030. So that'd be great. And indeed, Keynes was right. We are now in countries like France or UK or Holland, we are about 5 times as rich as we were in 1930. But the second prediction that Keynes did is that we would be working less and less and less, because we would trade every year a little bit of this prosperity for a little bit extra leisure. And that wasn't a very weird prediction, because we had been doing it for more than 70 years. Since 1850, 1860, the work week had been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So Keynes predicted that we would have a 15-hour work week in 2030. Sounds crazy, but everyone believed that at the time. All the great historians, sociologists, economists, they all thought we would be working less and less and less. Isaac Asimov, great science fiction writer, he wrote an essay for the New York Times in, I believe, the beginning of the 60s. And he said, well, the great challenge of the future is going to be boredom. What are we going to do with all our time? And the biggest profession will be the psychologists, because they'll have to treat us all as people suffering from boredom. That's what they'll be doing. Now, he was right that psychologists are one of the biggest professions nowadays, but they're not treating the symptoms of boredom, I can assure you. They're treating the symptoms of stress and burnout and work-related depressions. So something went terribly wrong here. And it all started in the 1980s. There are 2 explanations. The first one is consumerism. We keep on buying stuff we don't like to impress people we don't like either. That's sort of the most popular explanation for this. I believed this for quite a long time, until I read an essay by an American anthropologist, David Graeber, which I believe is one of the great thinkers of our time. And he introduces this very scientific concept of bullshit jobs. So what he says in that essay he published a few years ago, he says, well, who's making all that crap that we don't need? Obviously, it's not us. In modern rich countries, about 3/4 of the workforce is in the service sector. We're not working in farms and factories anymore. That's all being done by wage slaves in Bangladesh or by robots. So that consumerism can be the explanation. I mean, consumerism is probably a bad thing, but it's not the explanation for that we're working so hard. What we have seen in the past 30 years is an extraordinary rise in jobs that simply do not need to exist. And it's very important to say that it's not me saying that these jobs are useless, it's people themselves saying it. So at first I was skeptical about this, but then I started writing about it, and there was an outpouring of confessions, people emailing me and tweeting me and Facebooking me and said, yes, I've got one of those useless jobs as well. And I mean, it's not the garbage men, the teachers, and the care workers. You know, it's often people who are paid quite well, who have lovely pensions, like management consultants or corporate lawyers or bankers or whatever. I also discovered, this is even more fascinating, the whole idea of what you could call the part-time bullshit job. So what happens is that people do, I don't know, for example, a banker does work he or she absolutely hates, but then earns a lot of money and uses that money to do pro bono work for a cause he or she really believes in. So I call that the circle of bullshit. In journalism, it happens a lot as well. So what you do is, it's very hard to earn money with investigative journalism. So what you do is you write ads for companies you hate, and then you use that money to do investigative journalism into exactly those kind of companies. It's a circle of bullshit. And I started becoming more and more convinced by this explanation, but I was finally convinced when I saw the numbers coming in. So just 2 years ago, there was the first poll that was done in the UK that found that 37% of British workers think their job is completely useless. Most of them live in London, many of them in the city. Actually, the world record is now actually my country, where 40% of people think their job is completely useless. I haven't seen numbers in France. I've seen from Flanders, it was about 30%. And it sort of explains it all. I mean, we could cut the working week by about a third and we'd still be on track for Keynes' prediction. So this is probably it. Because we have this ideology of work, that you have to work for your money, and we have this very narrow definition of what work is. We don't include volunteers' work, for example, in GDP. Because of all that, we keep on inventing useless jobs. Now, there are some people who say, well, the robots will take all the jobs in the future. Well, my response is, never underestimate capitalism's extraordinary ability to come up with new meaningless jobs. Again, it's not the technology, it's the ideology.
On the subject of ideology and definitions, and I'm very conscious there will be questions from the audience, so I'm going to make this my last one, but I did want to bring this up because I think this is one of the, perhaps will prove one of the most contentious points in the book, is the subject of borders. Now, you're a great advocate for ultimately complete open borders. I mean, you describe borders as the single biggest cause of discrimination in the world today. Just concerning the sort of the practical possibility of implementing that. So, for example, with the universal basic income, you know, I could see it perhaps over the next 5-10 years getting accepted by certain countries, other countries kind of picking up and following on. The idea of kind of removing borders, it seems much more radical in a way, and particularly with the way political discourse has turned, it seems perhaps less likely than it did 10 years ago, let's say. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that. Do you think this is something which you could see as equally feasible as the universal basic income within a similar time frame? Or are there certain elements of the utopia we can work towards which you could say, yeah, this would be a great idea, but it probably won't be for several generations, for example?
Well, again, it helps to stop watching the news here. Because if you watch the news, then you have this idea that we are in a huge crisis and that Europe is being, I don't know, engulfed by migrants and that we can handle it, etc. And then if we study history, we'll quickly find out that in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, borders hardly existed. So it has happened before in what they call the first age of globalization. And then if we zoom out again as well, we also see that, you know, throughout world history, it's always been the countries, the nations and the empires that were most open to diversity, that were tolerant, that were able to attract the talent around the globe towards them, that were most successful in the end. I know that the idea of open borders is nowadays the most radical, crazy utopian idea in the book. But I just would like to invite you to imagine yourself living in the year 2200 and to look back on our time. You know, we can now look back on the Middle Ages and we can clearly see that they were quite uncivilized in many ways. You know, if you think about torture or witch hunts or whatever. Just imagine yourself living in the year 2200. Look back on our times. What is the most barbarian thing you see? What is the biggest source of injustice? Well, I would say two things. The way we treat animals and borders. It's pretty clear. I mean, borders nowadays, it's global apartheid, you know. And many of the arguments we have against it, that they'll drive down wages, that they're all terrorists or criminals, that they'll take our jobs, etc. I look at all the scientific evidence. I look at all those arguments, and it turns out that it's all nonsense, pretty much.
On which note, I'm going to turn things over to the audience. If you have a question for Rutger, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. People are all over the shop, upstairs, outside. So I also, please keep your questions brief so we can get through as many as possible. So who would like to kick us off? This gentleman, just here.
Thanks very much. My name is Jerry. I'm from the UK. I haven't had as much time to think about this as you, but something came to mind when you're talking about universal minimum income. Would there be a maximum universal income? Because poverty will be relative. In the UK now, we have people who have Sky TV, 3 TVs, cars, and they say, I'm poor. If you give them a universal minimum income that takes them to here, and the top goes even higher, they're still relatively poor.
Well, I'm in favor of a basic income that would be financed in such a way that it would reduce inequality. I mean, basic income, the devil is in the details, to be honest. There are many ways to implement it, and there are some ways that I wouldn't be in favor of. For example, I think it would have to be a supplement on top of certain parts of the welfare state as we have now, you know. There are some in the US, for example, that say, let's get rid of universal healthcare, let's get rid of public education, and let's just give one basic income. Well, I think that'd be a disaster, very bad idea. We in Europe know that universal healthcare is a pretty good idea. So I think it's important to look at the details. Now, if you're worried about inflation or something like that, it's funny, I get that question all the time. Is basic income going to cause mass inflation? Because that will sort of be the new standard, the new zero, something like that. That only happens if you print the money. If you just increase the money supply, then sure, at some point you'll get inflation. But if you finance this with taxes, so to put it bluntly, if you let the rich pay for the basic income of the poor, you don't have to worry about that.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, there's one back there. Maybe the person can come.
Hello. I wanted to know if there was some reflection on how to apply it universally, not only by country, but maybe overall everywhere.
Well, you're a much greater utopian thinker than I am. I'd all be in favor of that. I think it's probably the nation state is still one of the biggest sources of solidarity and unity that we have these days. So it's probably smart to start on a nation level. There are some people who say we could do it in Europe. And I think that on paper that sounds fantastic. It's just that in the current political climate, it seems a little bit far away. But I mean, there are a lot of imbalances, for example, in the European economy between the north of Europe and the south of Europe. And, well, almost every economist can tell you that you either can dump the euro or you can start being a transfer union, so send money from the north to the south. That's basically what we need to do. Well, if we implement a basic income in all of Europe, that could be one of the ways to get such a transfer union. Politically, though, that doesn't seem very likely at the moment, but I'm all in favor of it.
The gentleman right there in the white shirt, we'll just get the microphone.
Thank you. So I think, yeah, you have a very good way to present the ideas, and actually I agree with almost all of them. But
great.
The subtitle and how we can get there, that's not really fully clear for me. Of course, you're saying ideas are changing the world, so it makes sense that presenting the ideas is the most important thing.
Yeah.
But I would like to know more how to go there. I'm working with a global campaign against poverty, and I mean there's thousands of organizations around the world trying really to get there.
Yeah.
But we are really facing problems really and therefore I'm happy that you are presenting these ideas in such a good way.
Well, I believe that we are getting there right now. We are getting there because you are attending this event. This is one of the ways of how we are getting there. Let me give you an example. A few weeks ago, I received an email of an older woman who lives in the Netherlands, and she told me that she had read the book and liked it, the Dutch version, like 2-3 years ago, and that she had sent it to her son, who had given it to a friend, who had given it to another friend, who had given it to another friend, who lived in Canada. And she said you should meet up with those people if you're in Canada anytime soon, because they're going to do a really exciting experiment there. So I got the email address of this woman, and I said, oh, I heard you're doing a really exciting experiment. Turns out that they already had $500,000 in government funding to do a big study on giving cash to the homeless, the experiment I've been talking about. I think that's how it works, Ideas are like viruses. They just spread. It's just that we need to recognize that we're not alone. I mean, there are a lot of us, and we can achieve a lot if we come together. Now, there are a lot of different roles to play in this movement. I mean, I play my role as a writer. You might be better at other kind of things, the organizing stuff maybe. I'm really bad at organizing. I think everyone has a role to play. But if I just look at what has happened around universal basic income in the past 5 years, especially at the local level, not in the political capitals of this world, but at the local level, where people come together, say, can we do a small experiment? Can we lobby our local politician or something like that? That's how it works. And I've been utterly astonished at how quickly things can develop then.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Oh, okay, over there. We'll just get the microphone to you.
Good evening. I think what's implied in the point that you made about consumerism as being a big problem is the out of control population growth. I wonder, I mean, if we extrapolate, say 50 years time, the population growth and the quality of the environment are the two major factors I think that we're going to have to deal with. But how would you, accepting that the population growth will continue exponentially the way it is, how would you advise that problem could be?
Well, I've always been a big fan of Hans Rosling, the Swedish rock star statistician who passed away sadly recently. And if you don't know him, I really recommend, look him up on YouTube, Population Growth, Hans Rosling. What he shows, quite convincingly, is that yes, the global population will keep on growing for the coming decades, but that will stop around 10-11 billion. And actually, we can't do much about that. What we see happening nowadays, and has already happened in a lot of countries, is what demographers call the demographic shift. So as countries get richer, parents have less kids. That's what happens time and time again. If you look at a country like Bangladesh, for example, in 1970, on average, women had 7 children. 7. Nowadays, it's 2. That's how quickly it can go in just 40 years. So actually, I'm quite optimistic about that. I believe that the real problem is not population growth, but economic growth as we currently define it. What we need to do is redefine all those concepts. There are many people on the left who say, well, I am for degrowth, I'm anti-consumerist, etc., I'm anti-progress. That's not a good way to build a movement. What we need to do is to take all these concepts, freedom, progress, innovation, consumerism, etc., redefine them and build a new ideology out of them. I think that's the task that lies ahead.
On which note, I think that's a perfect point to leave it. We have stacks of Utopia for Realists at the front. I imagine Rutger would be happy to sign copies for you. And for Colette. Do stick around. We're going to be having a glass of wine, continuing the conversation. I really can't recommend the book enough. It's engaging. It's inspirational. Some of the ideas are very provocative. You might not agree with them all, but it's definitely getting the conversation going. So buy copies for yourselves, buy copies for your friends, your family, and just join me one more time in giving it up for Rutger Bregman. Thank you very much.